Du Fu, Elegies on Ancient Sites number 5, Zhuge Liang. Zhuge's famous name hangs over the whole world. The revered statesman's portrait awes with its sublimity. The empire, carved into thirds, hindered his designs, yet he soars through the ages, a lone feather in the sky. He is brother to such greats as Zhuge Liang and Liu Shan. If he had established control, Xiao and Cao would be forgotten. But the cycle had passed. Han fortunes could not be restored. His military strategy a failure, his hopes dashed, his body perished. So this is the fifth and last of Du Fu's Elegies on Ancient Sites, and with this poem we also put an end to Du Fu's contributions to the heptasyllabic regulated poems section of this book. And he is the best represented poet in this section with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 poems, closely followed I think by Li Shangjing, who has at least 10, but we will see that later on. So I already introduced this poem a lot in the previous poem. At this time, this is a poem written in the 760s or so. Du Fu is traveling down the Yangtze. He is visiting different places. And right now he's in the area close to the Three Gorges where Liu Bei, the emperor of Shuhan, died. And there is a temple there to Liu Bei, and there is a temple to Zhuge Liang, who was his main general, chancellor, and responsible for the success of his emperor to a no inconsiderably significant degree. What else can we say? So this is an interesting poem to contrast with another that we've already read by Du Fu. So Du Fu has a poem which he probably composed at the same time as this one, on the same topic, on the same place, which we've already encountered, which is the Ballad of the Old Cypress. Now, we read that one when we were working through the heptasyllabic old-style poems. So if you just take a look at that video, you can make an interesting comparison with this one. So the topic is roughly the same, as I said. In the other poem, I'm talking from memory, Du Fu stops more at describing a big cypress in the precincts of the temple, which is acting as a symbol for Zhuge Liang. And here he more directly focuses on the topic. This is also related to the meter that has been chosen. The old style allows you for any number of lines that you wish to incorporate, so it's more verbose and more detailed. A Lucia regulated poem is shorter. It can't have more than 8 lines. It can have 5 or 7 characters per line, 7 meaning that it's a little bit more prolix and the poet has more words to play with, but still one has to be more synthetic. And the parallelism is also much more rigorously enforced here. So what's the topic of the poem? Same as the previous poem, Elegies on Ancient Sites. So you can say it's a landmark poem, honoring a temple that one is visiting, reminiscing the past, in this case a glorious historical figure from the past, Zhuge Liang. We've already talked about Zhuge Liang in the previous poem and also about the Three Kingdoms period, and this topic and this figure has appeared in many poems in this collection. I'll just recapitulate one thing. During the Tang Dynasty, especially after the Anlushan rebellion, Zhuge Liang was taken as a model of the type of man that was needed for the troubled times after the rebellion, in which good military commanders were needed to finally manage to suppress the autonomous rulers of the north and northeast. Even before this, though, Zhuge Liang had been awarded a great degree of respect. He became deified in the Chinese tradition as a god of war. And even before the rebellion, there was an attempt at creating a supreme shrine for the military bureaucracy, which included a cult to Zhuge Liang. The Confucian scholars weren't too happy about this and boycotted most of the process because they didn't want a rival religious and state institution to parallel the Confucian temples and the Confucian civil bureaucracy and values. Still, Zhuge Liang can be taken as a model for Confucian scholars, and here you have the example with Du Fu making this poem, among others, for him. So topic, reminiscing the past, reminiscing a famous figure. He's probably been taken a little bit as a pattern for Du Fu. He says, I'd like to be like Zhuge Liang. But then again, this particular poem, this version, ends on a quite sad note, underscoring the fact that Zhuge Liang, for all his merit, was not able to unify China in the end. And so he was stymied in his desire to serve. Okay, then let's take a look at the poem little by little. Remember, so this, like the old ballad, like the old Cyprus ballad, this was probably written when visiting the temple of Zhuge Liang in Guizhou. First couplet. Zhuge's famous name hangs over the whole world. The revered statesman's portrait awes with its sublimity. So we already know from the title that this poem is dedicated to Zhuge Liang. The first couplet, more than locating us geographically or temporarily, just consists of, a couplet of praise to Zhuge Liang through two, you could say, this is typical metonymy. So a part of Zhuge Liang is quoted for the whole and is praised. So here in this couplet, his name and his portrait are referred to. So we're not just directly told Zhuge Liang is a great guy, or he awes us. Where representations or stand-ins for himself are used. So his name hangs over the world, like a Christmas decoration from lamppost to lamppost. So his name is hanging, everybody is looking at it. And his portrait awes with its sublimity. So there's a picture of him. Probably at the temple of Guizhou that was being visited, there was a mural of some sorts with probably an imposing picture of the general. So hearing his name or seeing his name, looking at the portrait inspires the awe, the respect, the admiration that such a great figure would naturally produce, only through these indirect references to himself. Next couplet. The empire carved into thirds hindered his designs, yet he soars through the ages, a lone feather in the sky. So, okay, this second couplet does move us now into Zhuge Liang's times and his actions. You could say that this couplet summarizes his efforts, but also his failures, his defeat. So this is a worthy guy, a noble guy, and yet he was not really successful. As we mentioned, at his time, China was divided into three kingdoms. His kingdom, the kingdom of his patron, Liu Bei, was the smallest and weakest of all of them, Shu Han, and yet, thanks to his military savviness and prowess and negotiating abilities, he was able not only to keep the kingdom for his ruler, but to defeat the vastly superior forces of the north. But, no miracles. You can do great deeds, but miracles in Lourdes, as I always say. And China was not unified by him. So the empire was divided into three. Zhuge Liang was not able to maybe become a ruler or a chancellor for the whole country, which would have been the case perhaps in other circumstances. And even though he failed to unify the empire for his ruler, he lived in unlucky times. This is a very typical Chinese topic, and Du Fu would feel close to it. The idea that a man, however worthy, can be stymied by fate. That is, if one is worthy to be an emperor or a chancellor, but lives in times that are not adequate, one will fail to succeed in spite of one's virtue. Still, Zhuge Liang, even though he did not manage to unify China, still soars through the ages, a lone feather in the sky. There is no rival to him. He is alone in his ability and his greatness, which cannot be measured by his achievements, because he was unlucky, as I say, to live at a time when the empire was divided. Third couplet. He is brother to such greats as Jijin and Lu Shang. If he had established control, Xiao and Cao would be forgotten. This is probably the more hermetic couplet for a person unacquainted with the Chinese tradition. But this couplet actually just continues the previous one. So Du Fu is said to have been a great man, and almost alone in his glory. Here in the third couplet, he is compared to the historically idealized examples of good chancellors for different dynasties. So he's the brother of Jijing and Lu Shang. Jijing was the mythical chancellor and main advisor of the first king of the Shang dynasty. Lu Shang, on the other hand, was also a legendary worthy that had assisted the founder of the Western Zhou dynasty. So they are two heroes of the Confucian tradition, two civil servants, two scholar officials who had advised their rulers and who had been very, very important in helping in the foundation of two dynasties and in their preservation to the descendants of the founders. Now, the Shang and the Zhou dynasty represented high antiquity or the classical period of Chinese culture. This is a parallelistic couplet. So in the next couplet, Jijin and Lu Shang are paralleled with Xiao Cao, that is Xiao Ho. There's two names, Xiao Ho and Cao Shen. Now, and it's said that if Zhuge Liang had managed to unify the empire, those great chancellors of the past, Xiao Ho and Cao Shen, would have been forgotten. So Yijing and Lu Shang were from remote antiquity. They were advisors of the Shang and Zhou dynasty, which approximately this takes us from 1700 BC to, let's say, 300 BC. Xiao He and Cao Shen were advisors and chancellors of the Western Han dynasty. In fact, they generally contributed to the success of the first emperor's rule, of the first emperor of Han, Han Gaozu, Liu Pang, and of his immediate successors. And they are clearly historical. We have a great deal of information about them, more than we have about Yijing and Lu Shang, and realistic, contemporary information. So they were both very important chancellors of the Han dynasty. They protected it against possible usurpations, and they were ennobled and enriched, and their families were important clans in the empire. So, however good, however prestigious Xiao Ho and Cao Shen, Zhuge Liang would have surpassed them if he had lived in better times. And finally, the last couplet hammers in this last topic of worthy man born in unfortunate times, and just explains why. Again, says, but the cycle had passed. Han fortunes could not be restored. His military strategy a failure, his hopes dashed, his body perished. So one of the things that Chinese believed in was they had a cyclical view of history. I think we've mentioned this already, probably before. So there was a cycle of dynasties. So when the period a dynasty occupies on the throne is a bit of an equivalent to a bank keeping some capital, some moneyed capital in its vaults. So the idea is there is a man that is virtuous, and he accumulates a lot of virtue in Chinese de, which is not only virtue in the sense of doing good, but it's also charismatic virtue, a bit like Roman auctoritas. That is, when you are a really virtuous, good person, everybody admires you and wants to follow you and wants to obey you. So for the Chinese political tradition in the Confucian line, this person, the most virtuous person in the world, should become the ruler, because everybody recognizes his authority, and heaven, in a way, acting as an sometimes impersonal, sometimes personal force for good, pushes this man into the forefront. So that's how a dynasty gets started. A very virtuous man, the most virtuous man in the land, generates universal assent on his right to rule, and they obey him. And then of course, this changes historically. The Confucians believed that in the remote past, emperors ruled like this and didn't transmit the throne to their sons. They transmitted it to the next most virtuous person. But already after Zhu the Great, the first dynasty was founded, when this Zhu passed the throne to his son. So the hereditary principle was started. The problem with a dynasty, that is a period of imperial rule where the emperors are related by blood, is that sons are generally, or don't necessarily have to be as virtuous as their fathers. So the idea is the founding emperor has this like stockpile of virtue, of debt, and his successors will waste it or augment it or preserve it depending on what they do. And if too many bad rulers come, that depository of virtue is wasted, and when it's completely exhausted, the dynasty has lost its right to rule, the mandate of heaven, and heaven gives the right to rule to another man of another dynasty. And a new dynasty gets started. And this is generally preceded by the consequences of misrule, like natural signs that heaven is displeased with the ruler, like earthquakes, famines, floods, droughts, but also rebellions and civil unrest. So the idea behind this idea that the cycle had passed, is before the Three Kingdoms, the Han Dynasty had ruled China for about 400 years with a short interruption. And the belief is Han has exhausted its mandate. It's had good rulers, but for the last centuries before its fall, it had mainly bad rulers. The mandate, the virtue is exhausted, and so it was time for the Han to fall. They still managed to preserve, at the fall of the Han Dynasty, a small redoubt, a small territory that still obeyed the Han. That is, Zhuge Liang's ruler was a member, a very secondary branch member of the Han ruling house, but he managed to preserve this state for the Han Dynasty for about half a century or a bit less, because of Zhuge Liang. So Zhuge Liang couldn't restore the forces. He was fighting against the destiny, if you wish. He couldn't restore the Han Dynasty to the whole of the empire. At best, he could preserve it in a corner of the empire. So his hopes at success were doomed to fail. He was a tragic figure who did the good thing at the wrong time. So quite an interesting poem, and quite nice.